Good evening, everyone. This is Scott Spratt from Pro Football Focus. This is the Fantasy Slant, bringing you once again some great fantasy football advice. I'm once again joined this week by Michael Moore, a colleague of mine at Pro Football Focus. How are you today, Michael?
Good. How are you, man?
Doing awesome. It's already our third week of this, so it's pretty exciting that we've made it this far. The previous 2 weeks, we've hit on some interesting rookie players that'll affect your fantasy leagues both last year or this year and into the future in dynasty formats. We've already touched on running backs, and I would say the major wide receivers, although, as you know, wide receiver is super deep this year, and so who knows? There could be a lot more to get to there. But before we touch back on them, this week I want to circle back to both quarterbacks and tight ends, and I feel like we can probably combine those two, given that really quarterbacks, I mean, there are 3 or 4 guys. We were talking about this before the show, and tight ends, there are 3 or so main guys that are going to be the fantasy impact guys. So I think that we can touch on that there. So I think before anything else, do you have anything to say before we get started with some fantasy football nuggets of goodness?
No, like I said, I'm gonna dig for something worse than Jimmy Clausen for next time. But for tonight, I think we can just revel in that.
Yeah, we have a couple of interesting strands on the show. The first is the Jimmy Clausen watch that we came up with last week, and we're gonna have to see how we can expand upon that. I think Michael is gonna try to challenge me with a personal story of a player that did worse than Clausen in any respect.
Well, and that can be the format. It can be better or worse. Jimmy Clausen or player X. So
yeah, that's a really strong possibility. The other thread is really just my technical incompetence in the first place, because the previous 2 weeks, if you check this out on YouTube, and maybe that's not the way to go. Maybe you should stick to the podcast and listening in the future. But the first week, the camera was stuck on me the entire show, and last week the camera was stuck on Michael the entire show. So as Jeff Ratcliffe told me, I'm trying not to touch anything this week, and we'll see if I do a little bit better.
Yeah, I didn't know if it was personal, Scott, or what, but I think we got it.
Oh, it's been even, so you've had one show and I've had one show.
Right.
Okay, before we do anything else, let's just go ahead and get into this quarterbacks and tight ends discussion. You know, I think we should actually talk about some fantasy football for a change.
Yeah, all right.
Okay, once again, I'm going to go in the order of the Pro Football Focus Dynasty rankings that you can find over on the site. On the side of the right side of the page, you'll see those Dynasty rankings. I'm one of the rankers that participates in that, along with some other great rankers, Mike Clay, Pat Thorman, Joey Cardilano, etc. Definitely worth checking out. And this will be good to include a Michael's commentary because he isn't currently ranking on that. Well, I think I'm going to go in that order. I didn't actually check beforehand because maybe I'm just making assumptions, but I'm assuming that Johnny Manziel is the #1 quarterback that's going off of most fantasy boards. And if this was like a fantasy talking league about which players are the most popular players to talk about, then I think Manziel would clearly win that battle. But I'll have to ask you, Michael, whether or not you think that Manziel is really the go-to quarterback to own in dynasty leagues. He's 6'0" and 207 pounds, so a little bit on the smaller end. And he was picked in the first round with the 22nd pick by Cleveland. I guess I should just ask you straight up, Michael, is he your first quarterback in a dynasty league?
You know, I think you could also probably look at jersey sales too. He would rank first. But you know, and I've gone back and forth on this, Scott. He's probably my third-ranked quarterback right now.
Interesting.
You know, the Josh Gordon thing for me really set him back. Not to take a whole lot away from Manziel, but you know, not having a guy like Gordon there, I think, really hampered his value. And quite frankly, we don't know when Gordon's going to come back, if he's going to come back. As you alluded to, he's short. He's definitely not your conventional pocket passer quarterback. I mean, he does a lot of improvising. He does run around a lot. It just seems like there's a lot of stuff going against him for me. And I'm traditionally a more conservative dynasty player anyway. That for me, I've probably got Bridgewater and Bortles ahead of him at this point. Again, not to take anything away from Manziel. I mean, he's got a great arm. He had a great combine. But, yeah, it's just the supporting cast there and the fact that he, you know, let's face it, is not your prototypical guy kind of scares me a little bit.
Well, you brought up some really interesting points, Michael, that I'm going to try to get to all of them before we move on to those other guys to hear about why you like the other ones more than you like Manziel. But specifically with Manziel, you bring up the Josh Gordon suspension. As we sit here now, we assume that Gordon will not play for the Browns this season, which opens up a pretty massive hole in terms of skill position players for the Browns. They have Jordan Cameron there, who had a very nice breakout season at tight end. Other than that, they brought in Miles Austin, who maybe could be in for a comeback year. He's a player that I think makes sense as a flyer late in drafts, but who obviously has had a lot of hamstring injuries in his career, and who knows if he'll be able to stay healthy for a season. But for Manziel specifically, Manziel is probably the quarterback that seems most likely to start quickly. I guess you could argue about Bridgewater too. But not having Gordon there, do you think the fact that he may not have very good players around him could somehow hurt his long-term potential? Like, will it stunt his growth, maybe taking a lot more hits, or maybe just not having the developing chemistry that you would expect having a really good receiver like Gordon around?
Yeah, I think you make a perfect point, which is, Manziel's game is really improvisation, and he's going to have to improvise a lot in Cleveland, quite honestly. I mean, he's not going to have the Josh Gordon safety valve that he would have had. At Texas A&M, he had Mike Evans, who himself was a very good receiver, who bailed him out of a lot of stuff. So, I think, yeah, you're right. He's going to have to shake some defenders off, and it's a matter of, can he do that at this level? And right now, I need to believe it, or I need to see it before I believe it, I think.
Okay, well, Kyle Shanahan has come in to be the offensive coordinator there. I think I have that right. And Shanahan was there in Washington when Robert Griffin was drafted and sort of developed him into a fantasy star his rookie season. I mean, am I drawing too much of a comparison there? Do you think Manziel compares to Griffin as an athlete? And could that maybe lead to enough rushing production to offset maybe the accuracy concerns or the lack of passing yards that Manziel may have this season?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's probably a pretty fair comparison. I mean, both guys are mobile. Both guys have, very good arms. For Manziel, it's going to be a matter of how long he can stay in the pocket, because, you could get away with that a lot at Texas A&M, but, the NFL, you're going to have to stand in the pocket and take some hits. And I was trying to think of a comparison of a guy that was mobile with a good arm that lasted, and Mike Vick is really the only one that comes to mind. And even he wasn't necessarily a clean bill of health his whole career. So, it's just, I just get I would be nervous if Manziel was my franchise quarterback or my dynasty quarterback.
So, but getting off of dynasty briefly, if you were talking about a redraft league, now I'm not sure any of these guys really should be on radars, especially in shallower leagues with only 10 or 12 starters. But do you think Manziel is the quickest of these guys to start? And if so, do you think he makes the most sense as maybe a late round flyer in a redraft league?
Well, your first question, I'm more in the Bridgewater camp, quite honestly. I think, both Cleveland and Minnesota traded up, so they both obviously think highly of both these guys. But for me, the depth of the position is just, I don't want to say a lot worse, but it's not as good in Minnesota, I think, personally, as it is in Cleveland. And I think Bridgewater is probably even more pro-ready than Manziel right now. And I think when you put those two together, it probably means, for me, Bridgewater starting early. Now, I think both Bridgewater and Manziel, in redraft leagues anyway, like you said, they're not going to be your starter in 10 and 12-team leagues by any means. But if you got a late-round pick and you need a backup quarterback or even a third quarterback that you want some high ceiling on, I think either one of those guys would work.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, we've talked a lot about Bridgewater already, but let's get to him more formally. Bridgewater is 6'2", 214 pounds. He was also a round one pick. He was the last pick of the round and going to Minnesota. He, before the year started, many thought that he was going to be the guy. He fell a lot late in the draft process because of some disappointing combine and other draft workouts. He's a bit of a smaller player too, but not as small as Manziel. And I think that whereas Manziel is really known for his ability to go down the field, that may be the one major limitation of Bridgewater is his downfield accuracy. But I'm touching on some of his weaknesses. I mean, you clearly really like Bridgewater, at least relative to these other guys. What is it that stands out to you? Is it the offense? Is it some skill that he has? Sometimes when a guy falls late in the process, that leads to maybe getting a value pick for both a team and a fantasy owner. Is that what you're seeing right now?
Yeah, I think, he probably was in the most, not that it was pro style, but, he was probably the closest of the big three rookie quarterbacks here of Bortles, Manziel, and Bridgewater at Louisville. And, he was very accurate. Now, given, like you touched on, it wasn't like he had a lot of deep balls. It was a lot of short to intermediate passes. But still, his completion rate was very good. And for me, he probably steps into the best situation offensively of any of these rookie quarterbacks. You've got, obviously, Adrian Peterson, which is a given, but you got Cordarrelle Patterson, who, is a guy that can make a lot of things happen after the catch. So it's not necessarily like Bridgewater needs to necessarily chuck it. He can get those, 5 to 7 yard passes to Patterson and just watch him go. And you still have a Kyle Rudolph who, may or may not return to form. But for me, a big thing is having Norv Turner there as offensive coordinator too. I think that can't be understated enough. I mean, Norv Turner has a very good track record as an offensive coordinator of really, developing quarterbacks that you wouldn't think could be very productive, whether in the NFL or fantasy or dynasty leagues, and making them pretty good. So, for all those things, I would probably take Bridgewater over the other two right now.
I think you touched on my number one point with Bridgewater, and I think he just meshes very well with the current players on the Vikings. You mentioned how effective Patterson is after the catch, but too, having Adrian Peterson there to catch balls out of the backfield, Kyle Rudolph, another big target who isn't necessarily going to be a downfield threat. I don't feel like they have the personnel where you sort of scream that you need to have the downfield ability that the Bridgewater may lack. So I think it's a really strong fit. And for me, that's why I think Bridgewater may be an effective player in the short term as well. So the number 3 guy, strangely enough, was the first one actually taken in the NFL draft, and that's Blake Bortles, who went to the third pick to Jacksonville. He's 6'5", 232 pounds, so he's the more typical size you would expect from a franchise type of quarterback. Probably has quite a bit to do with why Jacksonville drafted him where they did. Now, he played at UCF, so he was sort of an unknown coming into the whole process, but I think just has the measurables and everything else that you would dream of in a quarterback, and that's how he sort of became a late riser up the boards. So, Michael, what do you think of Bortles as a prospect? For one, he lands on Jacksonville, which, I mean, despite some of the additions they've made at the skill positions this offseason, still doesn't really seem like a competitive team in the short term. Is this a player that can pay any dividends in the short term, or is it a player that's strictly a long-term play?
No. To your first question, I should say. I think if you're expecting anything from Bortles this year, you're going to be mistaken. But given there hasn't been any indication of that, I mean, Jacksonville is the company line there is he's going to sit and he's going to watch and he's going to learn and hold a clipboard. So, if they stay true to that, I think he's obviously an ideal taxi squad guy if your leagues are big enough and have big enough roster sizes. And he could eventually be the best out of these 3. I mean, we're not exactly talking about Andrew Luck type prospects with any of these 3 guys. So, I think long term, I think there's a chance he ends up being the best, but I don't see it for at least 2 to 3 years. And that's not to say he's not on a good team, or rather a good up-and-coming team. I mean, they did draft Marquise Lee. They did draft Allen Robinson, who I think both are going to be very good. They still have Cecil Shorts, who I think in the slot could be very good. So, I think if you draft him, don't spend an early pick on him by any means. But, if you're late second, early third, and maybe you've got a guy like Brady or Manning or Breeze on your roster who aren't going to last forever, I think Bortles is probably the perfect pick for you.
I agree. I've actually seen Bortles fall into the mid and late third round in some rookie picks. And if you're in a situation where you have a quality veteran quarterback, then I think Bortles makes a lot of sense for the pick there, because he's a guy that, you're right, in maybe 2 or 3 years something could work out here. And I want to point out too that now he isn't really fast exactly, but he's fairly mobile for a quarterback. So he may add a few hundred rushing yards for you, which maybe that's not really helping you that much against the average fantasy quarterback these days, but it is something that he does provide and can help sort of shelter you from some of the bad weeks in the future. I think the comparison I would make there is he reminds me a little bit of Donovan McNabb as a runner, maybe earlier in his career. So I think that he's got a lot of the tools, obviously. So to me, he makes a lot of sense as a late-round rookie pick.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just everything you said. If you can afford to wait on a guy like him, I think you should. I mean, I think a guy like Bridgewater and Manziel, depending on your league, probably has a shot to go, I don't know, what do you think, late first, early second, top end?
Maybe. Yeah, and we should probably talk about that briefly too. From your own perspective, so you like Bridgewater, these guys first, but so what sort of range are you looking at in, say, a 12-team rookie league When are you going to start looking at maybe drafting a quarterback? Obviously, your roster composition is going to have a lot to do with this, but given that I don't think any of us thinks that these guys are going to be top 10 starters anytime soon, you're talking about sort of upside plays for the future.
Right.
We've talked a lot about how deep this draft is, especially in terms of wide receivers. Are you looking at these guys in the first round at all, or are you looking more late second, even later?
You know, for me, I think the earliest I would consider a Manziel or Bridgewater would probably be early second. And that's a combination of not only their skill, but just, like you said, just how deep this draft is. I mean, I think if this were last year, I think you could have made a case for them being drafted mid to late first round. But for this year, with, like you said, so many receivers and, you know, a few tight ends and stuff like that, I think for me, it's going to be second round before I consider any of them. What about you?
I do have them all in, or I guess I should say I have them starting coming off my board in the mid to late second round as well. To me, if you're building a dynasty roster, you really want to make sure all those really quality wide receivers are off the board first. So that means, for instance, Kelvin Benjamin I would take before all of these guys. I would take both the Jacksonville wide receivers before these guys. But I will point out, if you're sort of an adventurous fantasy owner, Johnny Manziel is someone who could maybe have his value fluctuate quite dramatically quickly in his career. And if he comes out and gets the starting job, or if he goes out and has a big week where he maybe rushes for a touchdown, he may become a flippable asset in the way that I don't think either Bridgewater or Bortles are going to generate that level of excitement from other fantasy owners in your league. I think you could potentially treat Manziel as sort of a volatile trade asset and reach for him a little bit early with that assumption. But if you're just building for your own roster, again, I don't think either of these guys belong in the first round or even the beginning of the second round.
Yeah.
Okay, there are a couple of more guys that I want to touch on before we move over to tight ends. The next guy is Derek Carr, 6'3", 214 pounds. He was an early round 2 pick out of Fresno State and went to Oakland. So, I mean, we've had a lot of bad teams in Oakland over the last few years, and I feel like that's probably, people are going to hold that against Carr specifically. But, I mean, he lands in a kind of advantageous spot in that they don't really have a lot going on, and they may be looking to rebuild again for the future, which could sort of make Carr a quick ascender to the starting role there. They brought in Matt Schaub out of Houston, but he's had something of a fall from grace himself recently. So tell me about Carr. Do you like him as a prospect? Do you think he has any chance to start this year?
Yeah, I think he's actually probably got a very good chance. And it's not like I think Carr is on the same level as a Bridgewater or Manziel, but, you know, I think Matt Schaub is just that bad, quite honestly. You know, I don't see him rebounding from last year when he completely fell off a cliff. I just don't see it. And I think, you know, they drafted, obviously, Carr pretty high, and I think they could probably put him out there. Now, given, I do also think they probably surrounded him with a little better talent than they had last year. I mean, they brought in James Jones, who I think can at the very least be more consistent than the receivers they've had there in the last couple of years. They've got, you know, up-and-coming guys. They got Andre Holmes, who came on strong at the end of last year. They brought in Maurice Jones-Drew, who still at the tail end of his career I think could be okay when you pair him with a guy like McFadden. So, you know, I think there's probably a very good shot Carr starts this season. I don't know if he's going to do well or you know, be in that same level as a Bridgewater or Manziel long term. But yeah, he's going to get his shot early. I know that much. What about you?
Well, Carr makes me a little bit nervous, and you have to tell me whether or not I'm being fair or unfair about this. But
okay.
So Derek Carr is, in fact, the brother of David Carr, former #1 pick of Houston back when they were an expansion team. I think that was maybe 2002. Now, Carr, his brother David Carr, I mean, he was a very good player in college, but I think the thing that held him back from being an effective pro was his inability to handle the blitz. And he just got sacked all the time because he would hold the ball, and then just never get rid of it. And, I mean, it was a major problem for him. And everything I've read about Carr is, he's got all these great tools, but he really has problems picking up the blitz and handling that kind of pressure. And so I'm immediately having flashbacks to David Carr and his failure to start a real NFL career. And so is it fair for me to hold what his brother did against him specifically? Because I'm like, well, you know, they are related.
Well, okay, answer me this. Was David Carr a backup in Carolina? I thought I remembered that.
Oh, yes, he definitely
Okay,
was.
so
We have
see,
quite the track record.
I was going to say you might be a little biased, but genealogy aside, yeah, that's the knock on Carr is he just can't handle the pressure. And it's kind of funny. You've seen the reports out of OTAs this year that have it, him performing very well, but again, that's with no contact, and that's with that's not live action. So, yeah, I think you're completely fair. I think you got to reserve judgment on a guy like him until preseason comes around and guys are playing for real and see if he can handle it. And if it ends up he starts taking 3-4 sacks in a preseason game, you're probably in trouble. So yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think that's pretty a fair assessment. So.
Yeah, Carr's the perfect player to actually watch in the preseason. I mean, most of those games don't tell you anything at all worthwhile in fantasy, but Carr's a player that you actually get to see in there and actually get some pressure and see if he makes good decisions. So he's a guy to maybe have an eye on early then, because it'll give you a better idea of maybe how quickly he can become the starter to see whether he's sort of handling that pressure well.
Right. Well, and one last thing real quick, and again, like you and I talked before, I got hooked on Dynasty because of my fascination with Madden and the franchise mode. So I may be reading too much into this, but you got to look at the situation there with the coaching staff and the management. You've got Dennis Allen, who, if he doesn't perform this year, he's probably out as coach, which probably means a different coach. And even Reggie McKenzie, in the front office, could be out after this year too. And what happens is when they bring in new people in the front office or to coach, they typically like their own guy at quarterback. They usually don't inherit the previous guy's quarterback, especially if it didn't get them anywhere. So, a guy like Carr, I think he's probably got 1 year to prove he has it, and if he doesn't prove it, then you might as well cut bait on him.
I'm not sure his leash will be quite that short, but I think you raise a really strong point in that the difference between going in the end of the first round, the way that Bridgewater did, for instance, and the beginning of the second round is pretty big in terms of guaranteed money. So, I mean, we recently saw actually with the Panthers, and this was actually right around when the salary cap structure of rookies changed, but when you see a guy go in the early second, it's a lot easier for a team to, say, take a new quarterback the following year if they have a bad season, the way the Panthers did with Newton.
Hey, Scott, I was going to say, what Carolina quarterback was drafted early in the second that got cut?
Yeah, I think it was maybe Jimmy Clausen. Just having a little flashback there.
We're just going to try to find a way to work him into each podcast.
Okay. That can be the Clausen watch. Okay, but that's great. The point is, it would be a lot easier for Oakland to cut bait with Carr if he had a bad season than any of the other major three quarterbacks.
Right.
Okay, before we move on for quarterback, I just want to throw out, do you have any other guys? There's some other interesting names here. Is there another guy that you think is maybe a sleeper, someone that you would look at late in a dynasty draft?
No, it's a lot of developmental guys. Like you've got Savage in New England. You've got Logan Thomas in Arizona, who, anytime a quarterback is drafted, it always perks people's ears up. But you've got to face reality and realize, look, they're drafted this late for a reason, is they have a lot of work ahead of them.
I think Garoppolo is the one that's in New England.
Garoppolo. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I do want to touch briefly on Logan Thomas because he's probably the guy for me. You're totally right. He's 100% a project. I'm not sure he would have any chance of playing in the next couple of years even. But he is 6'6", 250 pounds, and he can run 4.61, 40-yard dash. He actually performed very similarly to Jimmy Graham at the Combine. Obviously, he's not a tight end, but just to give you an idea of his size and athleticism, he was around 4 pick by the Cardinals, and it's just a guy that I think I would want to keep an eye on and see if he can maybe develop his footwork and the other tools that can maybe help him become a solid quarterback in the pocket, because he has a ton of upside in that sense. And I don't want to compare him necessarily to Cam Newton, but they look kind of similar in terms of their size and speed. And so you want to say that maybe he doesn't have to become an all-world passer to actually be a real fantasy asset. So he's a guy that in a deep league I would look at in the later rounds of a rookie draft.
Well, and especially if you've got the starters in those situations now. So for Garoppolo, if you're a Tom Brady owner, he makes perfect sense as a late-round pick. And same thing with Logan Thomas. If you have Carson Palmer, Carson Palmer's up there too, I think it makes perfect sense to take a flyer on a guy like that.
Yeah, I think so too. Okay, before we spend the whole show talking quarterbacks, let's at least touch on these major 3 tight ends that will go in rookie drafts this year. We're going to start with a guy from my alma mater, actually, Eric Ebron out of North Carolina. He is 6'4", 250 pounds. He was actually the 10th overall pick by Detroit. And I don't think you can ever find a guy with that combination of size, speed, and strength. Ebron really does have all of the tools to maybe become one of the next great pass-catching tight ends in the league. But I have some concerns, but I want to hear from you first, Michael. Do you think Ebron can live up to the billing? Is he a guy that maybe can be a Jimmy Graham in a couple of years, a guy that you should consider with a top 5 rookie pick?
I think so. I think he's there for me. I wasn't as sold on him. I've really come around. And it's like a buddy of mine made a very good point, which is, Detroit, because my initial concern was, hey, it's getting pretty crowded in Detroit there with Pettigrew and Fourier and signing Golden Tate. But, they still drafted Ebron number 10 overall despite all that, which shows me that, hey, they're committed to this guy, and they want to make him a big part of the offense now and in the future. And like you said, he's got the size for it, he's got the athleticism for it, and probably could have done a lot more if he were at a different school. I mean, it's kind of amazing the stuff he did at North Carolina. So, yeah, for me, I think he's he's probably the top tight end rated on the board. We'll get to that in a second, but as far as a top 5 pick, I would not have a problem if somebody took him in the top 5.
To be clear, I wouldn't have a problem with anyone taking him in the top 5 either, because as I mentioned, very few players have his kind of potential. And if you want to take sort of a flyer on a guy that could become the next great star, Ebron really does make a lot of sense in that respect. Now, if you check out the dynasty rankings on the site, you'll notice that I have Ebron ranked, I think, by far the lowest. I have him outside my top 15 overall at rookie. I think I'm like 6 or 7 spots below the next guy, and it's actually because I just don't think he can catch the ball. And I think that's something that can get lost, especially when you're looking at tight ends, because it's so important to have the size and the speed at the position. It's really a trend you're seeing. You're seeing these power forward basketball player type of athletes that are becoming the next wave of potential tight ends. And it makes sense because the ones that have hit, the Gronkowskis and Grahams of the world, they just can't even be stopped. And so Ebron fits that mold physically, but if he can't catch, then I wonder if it can ever really work out. He had the highest drop rate at 11% of all the main tight ends being considered in the combine. And so, to me, Ebron screams Jermichael Finley to me. And you can debate whether or not that's necessarily a bad thing. The one great thing about Finley and about what Ebron will bring is no matter how poorly he performs for even the next 2 seasons, he's going to retain his trade value. The question is, are you going to be able to say that, okay, I don't think it's going to happen for Ebron and I'm going to cut bait? To me, the hands are what makes me nervous. Does it make you nervous at all, or is it something that, hey, it happened in college, now that he's in the pros, we'll see him really commit and make those concentration type of catches?
Right. No, I think it's a very valid concern. I remember that article specifically, and it was very surprising. I mean, I think it was double the drop rate of the other guys that we're going to be talking about, which, when you compare it that way, is pretty significant. But I think we can probably agree he's going to have a quarterback in Stafford that he's going to zing it in there, and he's going to put it in the numbers. So if he can't catch balls from Matthew Stafford, then I think you're right. He probably can't catch them from anyone. So I think we're probably going to know pretty early if he's got it or not. And like you said, if you can't catch the ball, then your value in the NFL and in fantasy and dynasty leagues is probably close to nil. So. Yeah.
I don't want to discourage anyone too much because I do think he's a great prospect. It's something to keep an eye on again, and it's something that makes me a little bit nervous.
Well, and I think he's probably another guy that in preseason he's a perfect guy to watch, because I mean it doesn't matter if it's preseason or regular season. If you're dropping the ball, you're dropping the ball. It's not like you're going to magically catch the ball better when it's regular season. So that's another guy I think that if he shows he has the dropsies early on, then that's probably a pretty big red flag there.
Okay, Michael, the second of the big 3 tight ends is Austin Seferian-Jenkins. At 6'5", 260 pounds, he is a big physical player. He was a round 2 pick, the 38th overall out of Washington, who lands in Tampa Bay, where they actually brought in a couple of other players, Mike Evans notably. So they're pretty much surrounded by 6'5" receiving options, which will be probably a lot of fun for anybody throwing the ball for them. I think Seferian-Jenkins probably would have been drafted in the first round, except that he had some injury concerns and actually some off-field issues last season that made him fall to there. But he's a very versatile player. and he can actually block in a way that Jason Morrow, who we'll talk about briefly, and Eric Ebron can't. Those guys are more wide receivers that just look like tight ends. To me, Safarian Jenkins is maybe the total package. And let's start there, Michael. Do you think the fact that he can actually block hurts or helps Safarian Jenkins' value as a fantasy receiver?
For me, it probably hurts. The reports out of Tampa this offseason have Jeff Tedford, who's the new offensive coordinator there, going a little more run-based than they were. They've got Doug Martin there. They've got Charles Sims there now. But at the same time, some of their roster moves don't look like they're going more run-based. Like you said, they drafted Evans with their first-round pick. They drafted Safarian Jenkins. I don't know what to make of it yet. They say run, but they show pass. So, for real life purposes, I think that's good for Safarian Jenkins. I think that means he's probably going to be on the field a lot more than a guy like Ebron or Morrow would be, at least initially. But he's another guy that's just in a crowded situation. I mean, if you were thinking of him as a red zone target, well, look, they've got Mike Evans for that. So you're going to be divvying up not only regular targets but red zone targets too.
Yeah,
so,
and Vincent Jackson. I mean, we forget about him because he's the veteran and has been around forever. But 6'5" as well. I mean, there's a lot of guys to feed, especially in the end zone. So
right.
That's definitely a limitation on Safarian Jenkins.
Yeah, I mean, the talent's there. I mean, don't get me wrong, but the scheme there just doesn't, to me, indicate that he's going to be a very productive tight end, at least initially. So,
I think that's a little bit the consensus as well, is that he may not have landed in quite the same situation as Amaro and as Ebron either. But for me, I think that Safarian Jenkins is really the most, I guess, the best value of the three tight ends where he's going. And he's going off as a late second-round pick in most of the drafts that I've seen among rookies. And I'm really in love with the talent. He's a guy that I think wouldn't have fallen as far as he did in the draft if not for those other concerns. And so I think that talent's just going to win out with him in the long run. And to me, I actually kind of favor him a little bit over Ebron. I recognize that that's not a consensus opinion, and that's probably not the way you should expect your draft to go. But to me, if you can pass over Ebron in the first round and grab one of the elite receivers and then swing back and get Safarian Jenkins in the second round, I think you're going to like your team a lot more long-term than if you grab Ebron early and then are forced to go after like a Martavius Bryant or someone like that in the second round at wide receiver. So it's just something to consider there.
Right. Yeah,
okay.
I think a guy like Safarian Jenkins is going to be the guy sort of lost in the shuffle in all this. And like you said, if he's there mid to late second, I think you should be very, very happy with where he's at.
Very true, Michael. Okay, we've been throwing around some accolades with both Ebron and Safarian Jenkins, but Jason Morrow is the tight end that actually set the college record for most receiving yards by a tight end. So obviously he's coming in with a pretty strong pedigree. He is 6'5", 265 pounds, so another really big player. I mean, he's big, but is he even a tight end, Michael? I mean, we were talking about this a little bit earlier. Is he just a really, really big slot receiver?
Yeah, he is. But it's sort of like you said, we were talking about this earlier. If your league, I mean, and there's no reason to think that leagues like my fantasy league or anything won't count him as a tight end. At least there's no reason for them not to. I think he challenges Ebron for first tight end taken off the board in rookie drafts. I think a lot of it just has to do with the situation. I mean, the Jets have needed a tight end for a very, very, very long time. And I think they finally bit the bullet, and they got pretty good value in the second with Amaro. And, now, and at the same time, they did sign Decker in the offseason, so it's not like he's going to be the lone target there. But I think with Decker on the outside drawing some attention away, I think that can open things up for Amaro. And look, there's signs that Geno Smith may not be horrible, I guess. I mean, I don't think he's going to be great, but I don't think he's going to be Jimmy Clausen bad, to borrow a phrase. So, for me, I'm really high on Amaro. Yes, he is a slot receiver. No, he can't block. But hey, that's not why you draft him in dynasty leagues. You draft him because he's going to get a lot of targets and get a lot of catches and get a lot of touchdowns. So, for me, Amaro's right up there with Ebron for me. What about you?
So I think I like Safarian Jenkins the most of the three, but if I needed a player in 2014, I think that's where Amaro really makes a lot of sense. I mean, Ebron too. I think those two are going to be integrated more quickly in the passing games of their offenses. And you mentioned, besides Eric Decker, the Jets pretty much don't have any skill position talent, and they're going to have to rely on Amaro pretty much immediately. So I think that can do really well for his fantasy value. And I kind of like Michael Vick, so maybe that will buoy this team a little bit in the short term as well.
Well, if Geno Smith can reel off 3 wins last year with the lack of talent around him, then adding Decker and Amaro might give him a shot. So
it's very true. All right, I asked this for quarterbacks, but I want to ask this about tight ends before we head off for the evening. Were there any sleepers here or any other guys you want to consider in the late rounds of a rookie draft?
For me, Fedorovich, I think that's how you say it, in Houston, for me anyway, is a guy that I'll probably be targeting in later rounds. He went to Houston, and they right now have Ryan Griffin and Garrett Graham as their starters, and Bill O'Brien is going to run a lot of 2 tight end sets there. But they bring in Fedorovich, who, given was very productive for the lack of talent around him in Iowa. For me, that's a guy that I think could see a lot more action earlier than people think, especially in that offense with Bill O'Brien. I don't think they're going to be quite as conservative and run-heavy as they were before under the Gary Kubiak regime. Mm-hmm. I think they're probably going to throw it a tad more, but I think a guy like Fedorovich could work well there. What about you?
I think Fedorovich, and I can't say his name either, so definitely not throwing stones from my end.
Just call him CJ. It's okay.
Okay, yeah, CJ. So if you're in the 4th or 5th round of your rookie draft, definitely go for him over Troy Nicholas, who is the tight end drafted by the Cardinals. He's going to be a guy that's going to be in blocking pretty much all the time, especially on that team. We know that they've always been plagued with offensive line issues, and those never seem to really go away.
And they still are, Scott.
So until that situation changes, I see him going there in dynasty drafts, and I just don't really see it. So I just don't think he's a receiving option the way that Fedorovich can potentially be, CJ. Right.
Well, and I think his name is probably what's doing that. Going into the draft, I think he could have made a case for, the 4th or 5th best rookie tight end. But, yeah, you're right. Landing in that situation is just, it's not good.
And I think his profile is as high as it is because he is a talented player. He's just your classic example of a player whose real-world value exceeds his fantasy value.
Right.
And sometimes I feel like, especially with some of these unknown guys, it can be a little bit hard for people to distinguish. And so I think that's just a worthwhile tip there. I do want to mention another guy. I can't actually say his name very well. I need to watch more college football, clearly. But Colt Lyerla, am I getting that right?
Yeah, no, close enough.
He was an undrafted tight end who, if you were just talking about physical ability, would have obviously been drafted and probably drafted fairly early. Green Bay signs him after the draft, and he has had myriad off-field issues and is a major character concern, and I don't even need to get into all of that, but he's at least a guy worth keeping an eye on because if he ends up making the team, you can see maybe he has a 5% chance of this, but he has a long-term chance of being a star in the way that few of these other players do. And so depending on the depth of your league, I think he's a guy that makes a lot of sense as like a very late sleeper, is a guy that could maybe really break out if everything breaks well for him.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree. Talent-wise, he's just as good as a lot of those guys. And really, the tight end situation in Green Bay is about as murky as it gets. I mean, they let Jermichael Finley walk, who still may come back, but that's not for sure.
So, yeah.
They brought back Andrew Corliss, who, given his future is probably really as an inline tight end, not a passing or move tight end. They do have Brandon Bostic, who they did have some potential for this year, but he's been injured and hasn't really had a chance to make a name for himself in training camp. So, yeah, I agree. I mean, I think if you're drafting about now, Lyerla makes a lot of sense because there's just not a lot of competition there. And I think if, like you said, if he keeps his head on straight, I think he's got a very good chance to even end up starting there before the end of the year's over.
Well, Michael, it took us a long time to get through all those quarterbacks and tight ends, but I think we did get it done. So is there anything you want to mention before we sign off for the evening?
No, I'm going to start my Jimmy Clausen investigation, so I'll see we'll see what I come up with.
The gauntlet has been dropped, so it's up to you to try to find something better. Okay, well, everyone, thanks for tuning in to the Jimmy Clausen and some fantasy analysis show, the Fantasy Slant, powered by Pro Football Focus. Again, this is Michael Moore and Scott Spratt. So thanks for joining us this week, and we'll be back again next Monday or Tuesday, and we will talk to you then.